Hi, I'm Anderson Brown. I want to talk to you today about the history of cognitivism, is what I've called this, or the relationship between rationalism as we study it in philosophy and contemporary cognitivism and cognitive science. I want to move quickly because it's material that can be kind of heavy, but I think I notice as a teacher that it's a little bit of a big picture thing that I think a lot of people would be have a lot more understanding if they had a little bit more of this kind of overview approach as then we get down into specific things. So I do want to go fairly quickly, if I can here, through this. And all right, there's that. And okay, good, good enough. Very short history of cognitivism from Plato to Jerry Fodor. Again, hopefully this will. I think there's about 10 or 12 slides here. Hopefully this will take about half an hour or so, and just put some stuff together. So first of all, Platonic Metaphysics. Plato, very much a rationalist, what we would call a rationalist, and that first bullet point there, rejecting the view that cosmos was valueless, paradoxical place. Plato wanted to be an objectivist, both about knowledge in general and about ethics in particular. And so he looked for sort of objective foundations of value in the world. And Plato really thought that the universe had to sort of be, in a sense, kind of a person, because he wanted the universe to be a moral place. And Plato thought then that the mind was the thing that sort of defined personhood, as much as we were participating mind. Plato is opposed to relativism, wanted general knowledge. That's the second bullet point. Third bullet point, he found what he was looking for in mathematics. I think Plato's kind of all about the philosophy, the metaphysics of mathematics, if you will. I think in a sense, rationalism as a claim is something about the metaphysics of mathematics, in the sense that there's a claim that there's something about mathematics and therefore about rational cognition and the way we think about mathematics and logic that isn't really something that could be explained in terms of the contingent physical world and the physical science of that contingent world. I mean, I think, when you look around in experience and in the world at what might be the source of such a worry, that I think for Plato really is mathematics. But if you will, I mean, mathematics, looks like it has all the properties of God. You look at the fourth bullet point there, a unity, indivisible. If you have one little part of mathematics, all the rest of it comes. It's eternal and unchanging. It looks like it's mind independent, matter independent. Also, mathematics looks like it's a complete and perfect, right? Because it looks like everything follows necessarily. It's analytic, right? Everything follows necessarily from everything else, and so all right. So I think Plato made what looks to be reasonable enough, pardon the pun, idea that, well, you've got sort of physical science of a contingent natural world, but then you've also got this transcendental study of math and logic. And that's really when we're looking at the real structure of reality. In a sense, it's kind of simple as that. And then he's thinking, of course, that then that's what you're talking about when you talk about the mind of a person, the formal organization. Okay. So as to the soul, the Phaedos, the dialogue where Plato takes the hemlock at the end of the dialogue, and Socrates does, I'm sorry, and passes away. And so naturally, he and his compañeros are talking about the immortality of the soul. Socrates explained to his friends why he's not really that concerned. In fact, glad to leave the body. So yeah, again, briefly, second bullet point, it's the circularity of the wheel is a formal property that the wheel has. And the formal property will not be destroyed when that physical wheel is destroyed. And that is just exactly what he's saying about rationality in the body of a human. The same thing he's saying about circularity on the wheel of a bicycle, that there is part of that physical thing that does survive the death of the thing. Well, it's the non-physical part of the thing, the formal part of the thing. Notice that on that view, the bicycle wheel also participates in what we could call soul. Here, Plato, the right way of thinking about it is form. Again, the organizing form of the matter. Okay. Good news with Plato then, soul's immortal. The bad news with Plato is that there's only one soul, right? Again, mathematics is a unity; it's indivisible. Multiplicity is a feature of the physical world. So, so all right. And then the last bullet point, just quickly, we'll move on from the ancient Greek view there. Um, it's Kant at the end of the 1700s, coming into the contemporary period. It's Kant who says that what we're doing is sort of projecting an image of the world, or projecting sense and structure onto an unstructured manifold of things coming in through our senses, if you wish, that sort of thing. And necessarily for Kant, as I'm going to explain in a minute here, that's going to be a representation. But Plato is not saying that we can't see outside of our minds and we can only talk about the structures of our minds. Plato is earnestly doing real metaphysics. He doesn't see a difference between physics, philosophy, cosmology, ethics. He's writing in the middle of the first millennium BCE. And Plato certainly is making cosmological and metaphysical claims about the world. He's the sort that the Kantian claims we cannot make. He's definitely saying that, no, as a matter of fact, there's this formal level of being, and what it is to be a rational being is to participate in that. But all physical objects, in as much as they are formally, for example, geometrically organized, are participating in that. So, all right, a really original, the original, really basic distinction. And let's talk about that, because I think, again, as a matter of sort of general ed, or just sort of an educated view, this is an important point, I would say. Nowadays, first bullet point, we tend to see religion as, we live a secular life Monday through Saturday, and we live a spiritual life on Sunday at best, right? I mean, that's sort of the cliche idea. That faith, even we have a special word for faith because it's a separate kind of epistemology, right? It's not like ordinary knowledge that gets generated in ordinary ways. So that's our view today, and it's this culturally schismatic kind of view where there's this epic battle, as there has been for centuries now, between the kind of secular naturalistic view of things and a transcendental religious view of things. But just, I do believe it is important, again, speaking as a teacher mostly, I think it's important to realize, second bullet point there, that these people, the philosophers around, say, the Nicene Council or the New Testament and so on, people like St. Augustine, we call them Neoplatonists. I mean, there was this revival in the beginning of the first millennium, coming out of the Roman period, of Platonic thought. And you think of, say, the Holy Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, which is linking the Father to the Son. The Son is the Holy Spirit made flesh, right? God and a man. So always approachable, never attainable, right? Just like any formal ideal is always approachable, never attainable by its exemplars, against very strictly Platonic. I guess the thing I'd like to stress, though, is that idea that when we say that people have a soul, a classical notion of that, which persisted through the Holy Roman Empire, was the idea that it was your rational ability, your ability to grasp these transcendental obtainments of logic and mathematics, which was just clearly the demonstration, the reality of your immortality. Rationality and soul as being identified. And I think that's striking when you look at the way we look at the connection between, say, logic and spirituality today. And that's just, again, that last bullet point there. Science displaced religion as the epistemic authority, or at least tried to, right? Again, it's a struggle. And so in our collective mind, I want to stress it's a cultural trope, right? The idea is that spirituality now is something that's irrational or irrational, not the classical view of the soul whatsoever. Anyway, okay. So 17th century rationalism, a really curious, colorful era. It's people say it's continental. You're talking about something centered in France, where things are on the bubble, but you also have amazing thinkers like Spinoza and Leibniz. So Again, you got what we call the Baroque, that's the 1600s, and then the Enlightenment, which is the 1700s. The Enlightenment ending with these great revolutions, the French Revolution of 1789. And what these people are thinking about in the 17th century, people like Descartes and Spinoza, Leibniz, Malebranche, they're looking at the relationship between, as I would put it, mathematics and nature. It's a scientific revolution. It's a reassessment, trying to get science on the right kind of feet. Second bullet point, Galileo is really important in all of this. The history of astronomy in the 17th century is really key to understanding the modern world and modern science and philosophy very much. And so it was Galileo who really introduced, in a very persuasive and powerful way, this idea that you could have mathematical models of the movement of nature. And the whole idea that what nature essentially was sort of matter in motion, an idea picked up from Galileo by Thomas Hobbes, an early social thinker who's applying these new scientific ideas to that in his Leviathan. So the point here then anyway is that in that 17th century, the 1600s, the sort of flavor, texture of what we would call the scientific revolution in that century was really about thinking logically and mathematical models. Third bullet point on the slide, that this is really what Isaac Newton really is the apotheosis of all this. He publishes Principia in 1689, and in that he is saying, what does Newton say? He doesn't have theories. He doesn't explain why there's a law of gravity or how there's a law of gravity. He gives a mathematical description of the world. That's what we call Newtonian mechanical physics. It's a mathematical description of the world. So for example, with his most famous piece of that, gravity gives you, what does it give you? It gives the equation. So any two massy objects, it's about any two massy objects, two leaves circling each other on a pond, two galaxies circling each other in outer space, or a leaf in a galaxy for that matter, if you want, and you put in the variables and the distance and the mass, and you see the force of the gravitational attraction between the two massy objects. Again, Newton says, I don't have theories. I'm not explaining why this is. I'm just giving you the mathematical description, but the whole world can be described in this way, in this transcendental way, right? The equation of gravity applies to any two massy objects in the world. So, okay. So with that as the model, then you can see everyone then wanted to sort of maybe look at incorporate human beings into this study. And so then we get to René Descartes. Thing about René Descartes and rationalism in general. René Descartes is a mathematician. So René Descartes says, you know something when you've demonstrated it's logically necessary. And one thing to notice about that right off the bat is that we have logical demonstration of necessity of virtually almost nothing, including that the sun will rise in the east tomorrow, or that we have bodies that are not dreaming, and all the rest of that wonderful stuff. So naturally, it turns out that if you define knowledge as demonstrated logical necessity, it turns out that then you don't know much of anything at all. Which was the thing that David Hume reacted to and just didn't think that was a very reasonable standard of knowledge. And he came up with his probabilistic theory of knowledge, that we have a sort of open-ended set of experiences, and from the regularities of those experiences, we are habituated to form expectations about the future, that the future will exhibit the same regularities as the past. Okay, that's the idea. And the thing about that, well, we'll talk about that on the next slide. Okay. So Descartes on the soul. Notoriously, as you already all have heard, Descartes saying, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. That is, he says, I can doubt all of these sensory inputs, but that there is something having experiences beyond doubt. And really the main property there, I mean, it's the dubitability, the doubtableness of sensory experiences versus the indubitability of logical syllogisms. That's really the main reason why Descartes becomes a mind-body dualist. He says, look, or his argument for it, that is, he says, there is physical substance and then there is mental substance. They're not the same thing. They don't share all the same properties. That's the argument. What's the property? Dubitability. I mean, you can doubt it or not. Descartes' second bullet point, endorsing a version of the ontological proof. What's that? Again, that's the proof we identify with Anselm from the medieval period, that roughly we can conceive of a being that's greater than any other thing, but a thing that exists then is greater than a thing that does not exist, and therefore the thing that's greater than any other thing necessarily must exist. Why do I go over it right now? Because it's a rationalist kind of proof. It's an armchair sort of proof. Descartes' a rationalist. He's sitting there saying, what do I know by virtue of logical necessity? Now, of course, Descartes thinks that logic and logical necessity are the proper basis of knowledge because he claims that God is no deceiver, but he uses logic, a la the ontological proof, as the foundation, so he says, for his belief in God. And this is circular, as many people have pointed out. It's a sort of standard Descartes 101 thing to be told about. Last bullet point on our thesis today, or our topic today, Descartes saw that physical animals, including human beings, in as much as we could explain their behaviors in terms of their bodies, were like on that Newtonian model, these kind of wind up mechanical things. We could explain their behaviors just in terms of contingent physical facts about their brute physical natures. The question is, can we do that with human beings as well? And Descartes thought not. And Descartes identified that irreducible part of human nature with speech. He has interesting passages where he at one point has a parrot that knows how to make words, and he's talking about that in a very arresting passage from Descartes. But in any event, Descartes, back in the 1640s, 1650s, Descartes is identifying, very much the ability to speak, to understand, and to speak with the ability to reason. He says and sees that it's only the linguistic animals who seem able to reason in this way. And that's worth emphasizing because that's very much a central thesis of cognitivism to this very day. And the reason why someone like Noam Chomsky will readily identify himself as a Cartesian, proudly so. So then comes the 1700s, the Enlightenment, and there the emphasis all on empirical science. It's empiricism's day. The 1600s are about the continental rationalism. Again, this is sort of the potted history of philosophy that you get in school. And then the 1700s are about the English language empiricists. A hermeneutic for teachers, maybe a little shallow, but actually the fact of the matter is the distinction really does scan quite a lot through the ensuing history of philosophy and psychology. So you have this Humean view that emerges in the middle of the 18th century, that the world is that the world is just the secular natural world, and that anything that can't be observed, quantified over, if you will, is something that's incoherent to refer to, kind of illegitimate entity in your description of the world. This is Hume's anti-metaphysical attitude. He thinks this modern radical scientist is going to wipe all this stuff off. Just like all the practicing scientists don't know much about philosophy, but think science is going to wipe them off, wipe it out. Hume's one of those people a few hundred years ago. It's okay. Some things never change. So again, Hume says, well, you say there's a mind, but introspect, and what I see are the thoughts and contents, the thoughts and feelings, the contents of the mind. You say there's probability. I'm not sure. I think there's human fallibility, and so on. So a lot of the big things, values, mind, God, morality, Hume appears to be saying, at least, that these are items which aren't really things that are part of the furniture of the world. And Kant said that cannot be. That just must be wrong. It just cannot be that God and morality and mind and freedom, volition aren't really parts of the world. Um, and the way Kant dealt with Hume was to say that that this world that scientific methodology describes, the inductive inferential world of empirical science that Hume says is the foundation of all knowledge, is a representation, the way that the mind represents the world. And as such, it's not really a description of the way that the world is so much as a description of human perception of the world. That's Kant's big move, what he called his Copernican revolution. So notice then, and Kant then said that there is this cognitive, this conceptual structure to the mind, which is quite a startling one, including as it does time and space and causation and multiplicity and so on, but that's Kant. So we say Cartesian nowadays, we use the adjective Cartesian. It's after Descartes, it's indicating something Descartes would think, but Cartesian most people say Cartesian today, they mean a representational theory of mind, such that the skeptical worry emerges as to whether the representation is a veridical relationship with the so-called actual world, okay? That sort of Cartesian, and that's really actually Kant. It was Immanuel Kant, I would argue, who really sort of cements us into this picture that is so prevalent today that what you're experiencing is not the actual world, but rather your mental representation of the world. Okay. So empiricism and behaviorism, just the psychology that falls out of empiricism. It's really all there in Hume saying that learning, as I mentioned, is habituation. To have expectations about regularities in the future based on expectations of your past experience. Really fairly radical and what you would call nominalist position, really, that what you know is the world is really the set of all your experiences. And let me go through that first bullet point then. Hume's conditioning model of learning was philosophically ingenious. I mean, philosophers will be interested in behaviorist psychology past the point where practicing psychologists say, well, okay, there's limited returns in thinking about these theoretical things. But that's because the philosophers will be interested in some of the metaphysical and epistemological issues that emerge when you look into it. Impression that is mechanical impression, think of like a ball of wax with something pressing on it, leaving an impression, or an old traditional camera film that just had reacted to sunlight hitting it. And habituation, as we've been talking about, provide a consistent story about belief formation that doesn't necessarily involve mental representations at all. And that's followed on by, William James with his pragmatist theory of truth, and Wittgenstein with his functional role semantics, trying to get rid of traditional metaphysics of meaning. But it's all right there in David Hume. Crucially, empiricist approaches, as Hume intended, don't make reference to unobservable mental states. That's the first thing we learn about with behaviorism, right? It's based on intersubjectively observable things, and the private inner mental stuff isn't one of those things. You have the view that, well, scientific methodology means then you don't go there, and you have the more radical philosophical view of someone like Wittgenstein who say, well, there isn't really any inner like that at all. It's a kind of mistake. Behaviorism tries to make psychology a science just by adhering to empirical science methodology. Just don't do anything that violates empirical standards, and ipso facto, you're doing some kind of science. You're making psychology a science, and that's actually what's kind of good about behaviorism in a way. Is what's limiting about it. So, second bullet point then about Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is alarmed, just like Kant was, and for the same reasons, right? Kant is alarmed by the empiricists saying there's no God, there's no freedom. And Chomsky is alarmed by the empiricists. The empiricists are saying, well, really, belief formation and the basis of behavior and decisions and so on is all this irrational stuff. He was concerned for the potential for technologies of control based on the behavior modification techniques, like in Aldous Huxley, is also in Brave New World, where the working class babies are having their behavior modified, being shocked when they crawl towards the flowers and rewarded when they crawl towards the tools. That's a scene in Aldous Huxley's dystopian novel Brave New World, where he's criticizing these behaviorist paradigms. Noam Chomsky had, along the same kinds of lines, dehumanizing, controlling. So he was sort of against it. Behaviorists like B.F. Skinner at the time are saying, no, these are great technologies that will make life better for people. So finally, then, our two contemporary cognitivists, Chomsky and Fodor, Noam Chomsky and Jerry Fodor. Chomsky's a kind of generative grammar. He notoriously, B.F. Skinner published a book called Verbal Behavior in the 1950s, and Chomsky first reviewed it, and then he published a number of books, including Mind and Language and Rules and Representations. Here's the idea of generative grammar, that you have all of your grammatical rules, and think of the pronouns and the adverbs and the adjectives and all the structure and the places things should go. And that's sort of a lattice work and like a stencil. And you can put in the same way, notice that Newton said you can put in the variables of this equation. You can put in all sorts of different words into these propositional structures. So then, whereas an ordinary animal might have an alarm call, territory call, some repertoire of calls, but these are just what you call tropic calls. That is, the animal will just make the call given the right conditions, kind of what people used to call instinctual. And Chomsky's thesis with generative grammar was that the generative grammar of human language is what frees human beings from this. And again, very similar to Kant. Kant said that there was a kingdom of ends, a moral kingdom of ends, which are all and only those rational beings who have their own ends because they have rational, intentional, forward-looking minds. And that is the moral circle, according to Kant, where we can universalize our maxim for all rational beings. Chomsky, again, saying the same kinds of things, that it's exactly the same thing, actually, in as much as Chomsky is saying that in order to be in an intentional state, you have to have the capacity to form proposition, you have to have language, you have to have grammar. And so beings that are non-linguistic animals who don't have grammar, don't have language, can't really be said to have forward-looking beliefs and desires and hopes and fears. That really is the position. Okay, and as I say, that, if you're interested in the mental states of non-human animals, I think Chomsky's generative grammar argument is, was really maybe the only substantial argument for skepticism about intentional states of non-human animals that there is, really. I don't think it's correct in as much as it implies that, but it's the only good argument around. And then Jerry Fodor, I have a video here about Jerry Fodor. He can be a little hard to understand, but he publishes a book in 1975 called The Language of Thought, which says a lot about that, and being the colleague of Chomsky, the idea that human beings have a genetic endowment, which is a kind of innate grammar that allows them to speak. And Fodor went on from that in a long series of books where the basic idea is you've got sort of the formal structure of the representation, what you call the syntax or the grammar of, say, the proposition. And then you've got the neurophysiological state that's actually happening in the nervous system, some electrochemical process happening in some part of the nervous system, the brain, say. And so the big question is always, well, what are the psychophysical laws that explain the relationship between the intentional state, the intentional psychological description, and the neurophysiological state, and the description of the process that's happening there? And Fodor thought that, again, you have that syntactical formal organization different from the semantics, which is the meaning of the words. And he thought that maybe the semantic content of the phrase might actually be something that could be revealed in virtue of the syntactical structure of the phrase. And that is what would map onto the neurophysiological description. It's a difficult thing to get. Fodor's not an easy thinker. I would say to our audience here of undergraduates studying philosophy that he's like Spinoza. Remember, Spinoza thought there was both a psychological description and a physical description of everything, a double aspect theory. And in a way, Fodor's saying, and Spinoza, arch rationalist, Fodor's saying something very similar there, that we might be able to have a syntactic description and as well then as a sort of functional, at least neurologic description. Last bullet point, Chomsky and Fodor, thoroughly Cartesian. There's a central program that organizes thought from the top down. That's what rationalism and cognitivism is all about. And two, it essentially functions through the formation of mental representations. Any information processing, functional model of the nervous system involves you in all of this. So one really basic issue is that rationalism and cognitivism is committed to representational theory of mind. So let's talk about how that looks today, just for a slide or two here. We only have a couple minutes now, and then we're done with this. So the modern picture of mental representation, what form is mental representation going to take for various reasons? It's probably going to be formal rather than pictorial. Think of all the combinatorial possibilities of the 26 letters of the alphabet versus what a movie director's up against when they have to sort of frame and decide about every detail in every scene. So you have the propositional attitude model of intentional states. I want to explain what that means. Again, the propositions are the form of the content of the mental representation. You have a belief that Neptune is green. That's the form of a subject predicate sentence. X is F. Okay. All of these intentional states, beliefs, desires, hopes, fears, are then what do we call them intentional? Because they're all about something else. A desire to go to Neptune, a hope I get to go to Neptune, a belief that Neptune is green, etc. So again, second bullet point, cognitivism taking the intentional states to be attitudes towards the truth value of proposition, right? If I desire to go to Neptune, I want to make the proposition, I will go to Neptune true, or I am going to Neptune true, something like that. So belief, desire, hope, fear, again, what's the implication of this? And it's an attitude towards a certain proposition as to its truth or falsity. Now, the last bullet point here, I would point out, again, this is philosophy. It looks like these propositions are non-physical linguistic objects of some kind. That is, it doesn't look like they're part of the sort of physical furniture of the world. It's a lot of cognitivists are going to be, for example, a lot of theists are going to be cognitivists. Like I've mentioned, all starts kind of with Platonism, because the issue here is, a certain resistance to the idea, the ontological idea, that you're going to be able to explain everything as part of a sort of physical universe. And that, I think, is a kernel of metaphysical philosophy that cognitivism denies, because if you have a propositional attitude model of intentional states, surely what you're saying is that you think there are something like propositions which are kind of, you can't eliminate. So cognitivists, true to their transcendentalist origins, they say they're in the third bullet point, are non-generalists, ideologically committed to physicalism. The person who's a more empiricist sensibility, maybe a little bit like me, is going to be someone that's going to say, well, I'm not sure that that propositions are really going to be part of the ultimate furniture of the world, if you will. And computationalism, it's a version of cognitivism. Again, cognitivism thinks that thinking is a kind of logical thinking over symbols. Computationalism just says a classical computer functions along traditional cognitive lines. A pre-installed program specifies the symbolic response to symbolic input with a set of transformation rules. If you get an X, you put a Y. Okay, that's all that's meant by transformation. This symbol changes to that symbol. It's a rule-governed symbol manipulating system. And it's an extreme, so computationalism is this extreme form of that cognitivism, that what the mind really just is a kind of computer. That what it is to have a mind is really just to be a kind of computer. I would raise two issues about that in the last two bullet points of this slide. I think we might be done here. The computers that run, say, sonar programs on submarines or address recognition in the post office, or now they're all over the place with facial recognition. And for that matter, the chatbot programming architecture. These are systems that are trained with reinforcement schedules. There's an input layer, an output layer, and then you can reinforce the connective nodes between the layers. And you can investigate that more if you want to see what that means more. But the point is that you're training the machine to recognize by rewarding it when it recognizes it the way you want and not the other way. Positive and negative reinforcement. And so again, it originally developed for things like submarines. It wanted intelligence through the school of fish inside of a mountain and other submarines, stuff like that. But this is bottom-up inductive learning. That is, this is not a central program. All it is a learning machine, just like Locke and Hume wanted. So computer engineering divides along the historical lines I'm discussing. It's just the case that when we look at the rationalist empiricist distinction in early modern philosophy, and we look at contemporary computer architecture and the emergence of connectionist and parallel distributed processing models of computation, self-learning machines, it just mirrors the rationalist empiricist divide in early modern philosophy. I think that's rather striking and inevitable, actually, I think. And the other last bullet point there is, and John Searle brings in something we are not talking about very much today, which is consciousness, phenomenal experience, very interesting topic, to make what I take to be a very persuasive critique of computationalism, in particular, the thesis that the mind is a formal rule-governed simple manipulating device or a computer, in his essay Minds, Brains, and Programs. He has a short book called Minds, Brains, and Science that he published a couple of years after that. So I would recommend that to you. I think that might be then the last of the slides. Yes, it is. Okay. So, okay, just quickly sum up. You see with Plato in ancient Greek times, looking at the sort of transcendental or mathematical structure of the world and saying, okay, everything is not going to reduce to contingent physical stuff. There is a source of value that is a much finer source of value than that. And then we see that tendency continue as a tendency throughout the history of European philosophy, and in the 1600s with the rationalists. Then we see it's just there full blown and still continues today. Another giant in that is Kant. And so again, what's the thesis? That when we look at cognition and we see that it has a kind of logical structure, it looks like it's kind of based on the mathematical or formal structure of the world, or look, Chomskyans will tell you, look, there's a lot that's arbitrary about human grammar, which is evidence that it's an evolved trait. It's important to Chomskyans to say that it's an evolved trait, the way wings and flight and birds are, than larynxes and speeches for human beings. And I think that's fair enough. I mean, certainly it's a good point to emphasize. So then again, the idea is that there's some kind of a priori that's prior to experience, in place kind of top-down structure, formal structure that is kind of influencing and organizing our minds, our thoughts, and our speech. In a sense, that's kind of the meaning of cognitivism. So a lot of then what you're going to be studying is this is the structure, the formal structure, the grammar. Of course, the grammar of language, something that is amenable to scientific investigation, something that linguistics look at a lot. Semantics, how things refer, how language refers to things, a much more philosophical issue and a much sort of harder issue to nail down. All right, so I hope that any of that was helpful. Again, a history of cognitivism with the goal to show you the relationship between these traditional rationalist philosophers and cognitivism, and maybe help understand what the cognitivism theory really just is too. Okay, so I hope that was useful. Thank you.